Badlands, run into Badlands, explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
All right, welcome to this week's episode of Breaking History on Badlands Media. We're very, very happy to talk about a lot of things, past, present, and future, and context is everything. And the key that I was thinking about, we're called Breaking History, and I love the idea that usually people associate breaking news with current events, but breaking history is that it reminds people not only that it is the past shaping these current events, but that we are living in history, and that the future will look at these breaking moments from the standpoint of a form of lesson, a life lesson in generations to come, thinking, and people will be looking at our generations and thinking, did we make the right decisions? Did we allow evil to thrive, or did people become better people? Did they take a stand and become put out the best side of themselves that they could do at that moment in history, informed by knowledge and morality? So it's a really fun exploration, and I think that idea of the future as a component of history is key. And so Gordon and I today, we were just discussing a little bit of different pathways to explore and expand upon certain developments. We've got some things going on right now, some very serious situations in Rafah. We have the Putin speech or the Putin interview, which is still very important for people to hold that in their mind. It was just a week ago that the Western world had a chance to finally listen to an unabridged, full speech, a full thought by Putin, which never happens, where the leader of the free world, as I like to call him, was able to just illustrate what a competent, actual human leader whose mind works, what that looks like, what that sounds like, and he was able to really, I think, put across a message of what a sane sense of self-interest and economic policy is, based upon his relationship with China, with other nations of the multipolar alliance. And he made the point, look, the more the West has been trying to characterize the nations of Eurasia as their enemies, the more that they've sanctioned Iran, the more that they've militarily created these proxy wars to try to undermine the economies of their so-called rivals, the more that they self-annihilated and self-destroyed and undermined their own basis, and made the point, look, we want to be friends. China and Russia and even Iran wants to be friends with the West. We don't want to go to war. We want to build the economies together. We want to industrialize together. They're already doing it. We're invited to participate. But for some reason, there's something stubborn that's latched on like a little parasite that refuses to acknowledge our true self-interest and instead go for pouring more fuel on the fires. So I think today, Gordon, I know that there were some points in the Middle East you wanted to touch on, and some other things regarding Egypt. So how do you want to proceed?
Yeah, Matt. Well, it's good to see you. Yes, and that was a great introduction. The Putin interview is very important. I was tempted, we were tempted to talk about that today, but we discussed like a week ago doing the petrodollar today. And given I'm going on Rug Pull Radio tomorrow night, so I think there's a good opportunity for some crossover with those guys. So I think doing the petrodollar today, and then maybe circling back in the future and revisiting the Putin interview, because there were so many good things that came out of that. Despite I think Tucker failed. I've talked about this on Badlands Daily a few times, but I do think that Tucker failed, in that the point of the interview should have been to go in there and say, is Vladimir Putin who the Western media has told us that he is, or is he something different? That really should have been like the thesis or the question, the hypothesis going in there. And I don't feel like Tucker took that attitude. I feel like he bought into the talking points of Putin being bad. And he was, I'm going to go in there and press him on Ukraine and figure out why he's doing, why is he, persecuting these poor people and all that. But despite all that, I think Putin still got like a lot of great messaging out. The best part being that Ukrainian means borderlands, like Ukraine means borderlands, which I didn't even know. I went and looked that up, and I was like, well, that makes sense now, because I've read so much history where Ukraine wasn't a country, but people were still being referred to as Ukrainian. And I never really understood why that was. And now I do. Now I understand. It's because they're referring to them as like, you're a borderlander, like you live in the borderlands. So that was a fascinating, I learned something from Putin. And by the way, it's like the 30-minute history rant. I mean, dude, it's like, was he trying to steal our bit? Because I feel like we needed to have him on this show to do the Russian history episode.
That was just glorious, glorious. No,
Yeah.
he was really like retuning our minds to, I think, appreciate that history is something which is much more rich and fluid than we often take for granted. We see a map which has these borders, and we just presume naively that the borders that we see on the current map are some like immutable configuration of these crystallized final states, which it's insane. Like you look at not just Ukraine, you look at any of the borders of Africa, anything, and it's so different if you take a snapshot and compare to 50 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Just see the evolution of the dynamics, and then and what I loved is that he was bringing in the nature of empire and the realities of history as being something shaped by intentions, designs for good or for evil, that then shape whether or not we have artificial ethno-national blocks that just emerge and that are used against a higher power or against another larger power, or if a nation is created in a lawful manner. And the fact that both Ukraine and Russia have so much common history, common language, common culture, religion, even a common founding father, Volodymyr the Great. I mean, it was just so rich and ironical that it really got across that it was more of it should be understood more as a civil war and less of any kind of war between countries. These are common brothers and sisters with a common heritage. And that's really what it is. And so there's a lot, I think, in parallel. And I know we're going to jump into the weaponization of the US dollar, which Putin also talked about, vis-a-vis the creation of a speculative market tied to the petrodollar. But it showcases that just like the West, just like I should even say the United States, has dealt with the hand of Anglo-American, but specifically Anglo intelligence operations that have fueled the fires of civil war in the 19th century. There's obviously an attempt to try to fuel the fires of a civil war yet again right now by the same intelligence agencies that brought us 9/11, that killed JFK, that essentially did the first 9/11, that are also fueling a civil war in Russia at the same time, and that have tried and did at different times in the past fuel civil wars in China. This is what we saw during the Opium Wars with the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom pseudo-Christian Gnostic cult that was created by Anglo-American intelligence in the 1850s that convinced some school teacher that he was the Messiah's brother and that he ran this army that carried out a civil war during the Opium Wars against China, masquerading as a pseudo-Christian, but again, much more Gnostic satanic cult that wanted to establish a new Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which was part of the conditions around which Britain was able to destroy China by the Second Opium War and establish the HSBC operation for drug running, as well as the Green Gang, which was sort of the crime syndicate mafia that worked with Chiang Kai-shek that facilitated the flow of drugs through the Golden Triangle into North America, facilitated by HSBC, a London bank, which is still at it again today. So, you got this whole historic effort to destroy the sovereign national development of various nations who would otherwise want to work together, as Russian, American, and Chinese patriots of the 19th century were trying to do. They're trying to build rail together, invoke national banking protectionism to build things like the Bering Strait Rail Tunnel that was animating the 19th century completely with Russian and American patriots that was going to extend down into China. All of that had to be destroyed when the chessboard was overturned, and what became World War I was put into motion that was animated by all of these civil wars. So we have a lot of similarities, a lot of parallels. And again, as Putin said, the dollar, the US dollar, was something we wanted to be a part of. We were doing all of our transactions in US dollars a decade ago. Now it's like maybe 30%. It's mostly rubles and yuan between Russia and China, as well as India, which also deals with rupees. So we're de-dollarizing and have it turned into or restored back into a driver of industrial progress like it was in the 50s and 60s. But you refused. Your elites got too much into their heads that they had this weapon that they could use to sanction and destroy and destabilize nations with this. So how do you want to begin? Because this does open the door to the whole petrodollar operation in Saudi Arabia in a few ways. So I don't know. How would you like to?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about current events a little bit, because I think that's like tying it back. And hopefully there's no streaming issue. I see people saying that there's some the stream might be a little jumpy, so just bear with us. Let's see. Okay, so all right. So right now what we have is, you've probably heard in the news about Egypt and Rafah. That's kind of like the big news story right now. And so let's explain what that is. So we are looking right now at Gaza. This is Gaza, which this is Gaza right here. And this is an old map from the 60s. So just disregard the fact that this line doesn't continue. Gaza was actually part of Egypt after Britain invaded Palestine and established the colony of Israel. Gaza actually became part of Egypt. Like, Egypt annexed it and basically was its protector. It became like a protectorate almost. So, but we're looking at Gaza right here. You can see they call out Rafah on the map. So that's the city of Rafah. This whole region down here is known as Rafah. And so what's happened is that the IDF started in the north and drove all of the Palestinians south, or most of the Palestinians. There's about 2.5 million people living in Gaza. And Netanyahu was telling them, move south, get out of the way. We're coming after the terrorists. Get out of the way, move south. So now you have about 1.5 million people. They speculate 1.5 to 1.8 million people are now like lumped together in Rafah, in this southern region, and Israel is bombing it. And a lot of innocent people, like women, children, are dying as a result. Egypt will not open up the border to let them come through, and that's the strategic reason. I just want to point this out because it's always important to highlight psyops whenever we can. So this is an account called Hamas Atrocities. I just found this when I searched Egypt on X, but there are accounts like this all over the place that are posting this rhetoric, including like neocon uniparty right accounts. And so it says the hidden reason why Egypt is nervous, exclamation point. This is showing the Rafah border with Egypt right here. Egypt is building a huge wall to prevent Palestinians from crossing over. At the same time, they're begging Israel to not enter Rafah and threaten military actions. What are they afraid of? With such a wall, nobody can cross. And it goes on to say, Palestinians are all like violent terrorists, and they don't want them in their country because of that. And while there might be some truth to that, there might be a sliver of truth to that, that's not the reason they're not letting them in. The reason they're not letting them in is because they don't want Israel to dictate to Palestine that the Palestinians have to leave Palestine, which the next step will then be the Israeli settlers moving in and taking over, which they've already started to do. You actually have hundreds of Israeli settlers now moving down to the border and are using their cars to block the border to keep aid trucks that are coming in from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, from Turkey, from Jordan. They're blocking the aid trucks, and they're saying no aid. These are just like civilians. They're saying no aid trucks, like protesters. No aid trucks can come in here. We don't want humanitarian aid to be provided to these people, which, by the way, is a war crime. This is exactly why Israel got taken to The Hague last month and raked over the coals, is because if you fail to provide humanitarian aid to people who clearly need humanitarian aid in a war, like in a battlefield, in a warlike environment, that is considered a war crime by international law. So that's why they were taken to The Hague. So it's important to keep that in mind.
I would just add one little thing. You see some of these videos, and it's like a block party, eh? Like there's just what appears to be normal people with Israeli flags, almost like as if they're at a block party drinking Kool-Aid and stuff, and having a nice drink with friends, blocking humanitarian aid needed to save millions of lives. And it really just showcases the insanity of this greater Israel brainwashing that has been fed to generation of traumatized and the creation of trauma through a certain type of brainwashing that's been done to these people that's dehumanized them in a way, and has dehumanized them by cutting off their ability to do the human thing, which is empathize with your fellow man, and instead see the Palestinians as if they're these Untermenschen, these underhumans that are destined by God's will to be purged from the land, which is also a concern for Egypt, because they're aware that the plan would be, once you have the Palestinians purged into Egypt, that at that point there would be a lot of opportunities to initiate false flags, to launch in missiles from people who have a lot of reason to have a lot of anger and hate against Israel, whose families have been wiped out. They've been highly radicalized, who are part of the more radicalized branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is still the deep state of Egypt, which has been working in collusion with British, with Israeli intelligence, with American intelligence for a long time. We've talked about this, who will give Israelis the excuse that they want and need to say, look, we are being attacked from Egypt. Let's go in now and reclaim the glorious promised land all the way past the Suez Canal, which is, by the way, it falls within the borders of the greater Israel dream vision of sort of New Babylon, which does take control of the Suez Canal. So I just wanted to throw that in there as far as another component of the Egyptian calculus right now, which is very important to think about.
Well, and it's a fascinating point, and I'll point out as well, just to bring that full circle, is that I think we're gonna. I said this on Badlands Daily the other day, but I think we're gonna see like an interesting contrast occur where I'm trying to find a Middle East map. Where so like right now, and this is just a random map, and so I apologize for just ignore all the markings. But basically, right now, that the Houthis have shut down the Red Sea, so you don't have any ships except Russian and Chinese ships are moving through the Suez Canal, but the rest of the traffic is not. So Israel is not being supplied from the Suez Canal right now. So what the Saudis have done and the UAE is they've organized so all these ships that are supposed to be going to Israel are now coming up to Abu Dhabi, docking, unloading their supplies, and in Saudi Arabia and the UAE are paying for trucks to drive the goods across Saudi Arabia into Jordan and into Israel. So Saudi Arabia is making sure that Israeli people are getting the supplies they need, because Israel is dependent on these ships to get food, to get everything they need. And so I think what we're going to see is we're going to see like a contrast come about where the Arabs are actually taking care of the Israelis, whereas the Israelis are not taking care of the Palestinians. But I digress. So let's get back to the crisis. So the Suez crisis. Well, real quick, here is a chart just to kind of put a fine point on this. This is the income. This chart represents just the income for Egypt that it receives from the Suez Canal. And you see in 2023, and then here's 2024, and you're seeing now how it just dropped off. It's tapered off. So Egypt is suffering economically from this situation. It's not like, for people who think that like all the Muslims are working together and this is all like one big happy thing. It's not. I think there's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of shades of gray that we need to kind of peel back the layers and figure out. So with that said, let's talk about this, like what happened before that brought us here. And so if we go back to the 50s, you have what's called the closure of the Suez Canal, which I'm sorry, in the 60s. But in the 50s, you had Nasser. Nasser came to power, I believe. When was it? It was
1954 or something.
Yeah, 53. So in 56, he closes the canal, and is aligning himself with Soviet Union. With he's trying to move away from the Western hegemony, who he doesn't trust, and for good reason. I talked about this on Badlands Daily the other day, but on 6 years after, so the Suez Canal was completed, it was built in 1869. 6 years later, in 1875, the Egyptian faction that had like the investment, that held the investment or the ownership shares, went bankrupt and were forced to sell to the British investors. So Britain ends up like taking all of their shares, so they no longer own it. And then 10 years later, in the 1880s, there's the Anglo-Egyptian War that kind of like set the stage for the Anglo-Egyptian War, where Britain invades Egypt and actually seizes control of the Suez Canal by force. And that creates a big problem that feeds into World War I and everything that was happening in World War I with the Ottoman Empire. But moving back to the 1950s, so Nasser then closes it from October 1956 to March 1957. That was known as the Suez Crisis. And then about 10 years later, you have the 6-Day War, which we're going to talk about here in a second. The 6-Day War, which is where Israel invades Egypt, and in response, Egypt closes the Suez Canal, and I think it remains closed until 1975. It remains closed. So it remains closed for like 8 years. And here's what happens. These colors, you don't really need to understand all the colors. The only two colors you need to understand here are blue, and then this like vomit green. Okay, so here are the 6 days. You got June 5th to June 10th. That's the 6-day war in 1967. Blue is Israel at the beginning of the war, and then like this vomit green is the is Israel at the end of the 6-day war. So what happens is that they move in and they occupy Sinai, right? And it's funny because I was watching a bunch of like news broadcasts, which I'm not going to play, but there are news broadcasts from 1967 where, and then even like 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, where the map in the background, it's like a hard map. They're not using screens, but the hard map in the background actually shows Sinai, and it shows it as a different color from Egypt, and it's calling it Sinai. And it's like, rather than calling it Egypt, and it's like, okay, this is occupied Egypt. This is under British occupation, because Britain and France were backing Israel when they came and invaded Sinai. And the whole point, like a big driver for them was the Suez Canal. They were upset about the closure, and so it's just funny that like that's how the condition. Like when people say, "I've been tracking this event for 60 years," it's like this is like there's a lot of nuance to this. It's like no. The event you've been tracking, the information you've been fed, has been coming from the exact same hegemony that is imposing itself and exploiting these people. And that's just proof. Like the news broadcast in 1967, the maps were denoting Sinai as a separate entity from Egypt, as if it wasn't part of Egypt, which is crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. I just add one thing on that too. You heard about the USS Liberty, right?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. Yeah, if you want to explain that, or I can, please.
Oh, I mean, yeah, just because it's something which a lot of people haven't taken to heart. They just think, oh, the 6-day war, that was a necessary war, and Israel just had to preemptively stop. Well, actually, I was led to believe in school when I heard about this that the war was instigated by Syria and Egypt and the broader Arab world that wanted to wipe Israel off the map. Like a new Holocaust type of situation had emerged, and Israel had to defend themselves, which they valiantly did. And in only 6 days, wiped out all of the air force of Egypt and the broader Arab alliance. And when you scratch on that very popular myth, you realize that it really just is a myth. It is completely a fraud. And you even had high-level CIA analysts who blew the whistle in the 1960s, who were in the Johnson administration, who wrote books detailing how this was completely a fraud. There was no evidence that there was going to be any attack. There was none whatsoever. You did have like Egyptian and Syrian military stationed as a message on their side of the border saying, don't do anything. And as a serious message of a sort of flexing of muscles, but there was no evidence that there was going to be any invasion or anything on Israel. It was a preemptive attack. And when Israel went and preemptively bombed these other countries and then took this territory, they also destroyed an American ship, killing over 100 soldiers stationed on the ship, the SS Liberty, which was a signal ship taking in all sorts of communications. And there was something that signal ship off the coast of Israel was listening to and recording that certain people inside of Tel Aviv really didn't want to get out into the world. We're never going to know what that was, but it was just immediately forgiven, forgotten, and we moved on, even though like 130 or so U.S. soldiers were murdered in this whole thing.
And for those who don't know what we're talking about, so the USS Liberty, as Matt just said, was a ship that was patrolling off the coast of Israel. And on June 8th, right here, during the 6-day war, that ship was attacked. And the initial report was that it was the Egyptians attacking them. But later it was absolutely confirmed that it was Israel, that Israel attacked a U.S. ship. And obviously, like, I mean, if you're using discernment, the purpose it was a false flag to try to bait the United States into the war, because Israel had Britain and France backing them, but it really wanted the United States to back them because the United States was the real military hegemony. So they attack the ship, and then they're trying to bait the United States into basically doing what Israel did on October 7th, and just without even thinking, just start attacking Egypt, which then would have provoked Egypt to attack America, and then we would have had we would have been fully in that war. So fortunately Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and that did not happen. And that's why it only remained a 6-day war and not something much more significant. But yes, so that's a perfect example of Israel not being our greatest ally. I think actually being our worst ally and trying to drag us in yet again, which is basically what it's been doing since it was created, is trying to drag us into the Middle East militarily so that we can fight their battles for them. Battles that don't need to be fought, by the way. So where are we? We are. So I think
what we can do is do you want to do a quick commercial break with this is a bit of a cliffhanger? Or, yeah.
Well, why don't you do that, and then we'll start talking about Saudi.
All right. So I'll do the first two, and then you could take on the second two. So the first one is Ascent something. All right. So there's Ascent Nutrition. Wait, is this Ascent Nutrition? Well, let me try this again. That is. All right. Sorry. All right, it's become increasingly clear that the amount of heavy metals, microplastics, and other toxins we are exposed to has only increased. That's why we want to highlight the importance of pine needles for our health. We've been talking about Ascent Nutrition for several months and want to spotlight their pine needle extract due to the important compounds in it and the effects that so many people are having. As you can see with the testimonies, many people have been using our pine needle extract for months and can feel more energy, have greater mental focus, and some people haven't been sick in over a year while using it. The taste is incredible, and instead of needing to make tea out of pine needles, you can get the benefits of this potent extract form. Prioritize your health. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv/ascent and use promo code Badlands to save 10% off of their pine needle extract and all other products from Ascent Nutrition. That's badlandsmedia.tv/ascent, promo code Badlands at checkout. All right, the next one is My Pillow.
To celebrate the new year, we're having the biggest sale ever on overstock clearance and brand new products. For example, save 60% on our Goose Down comforters, the best comforters ever. They go perfectly with our My Pillow bed sheets and duvet covers. Save 25% on our brand new kitchen towels. They're made with the same technology as our famous My Towels. Our initial quantities are extremely low, so get them now before they go. Our seasonal flannel sheets are finally in. You save up to 50%, and they sell out fast every year, so order now. They're truly the best flannel sheets you'll ever sleep on. Or save up to 80% on all our clearance items. And this is where it gets even better. For a limited time, your entire order ships absolutely free. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use that promo code to get deep discounts on all MyPillow products. And for a limited time, your order ships absolutely free.
Cool. All right. So, where were we? It was...
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about... let's talk about the first Saudi king after the founder of Saudi Arabia dies. So MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he's the current crown prince. His grandfather, Abdulaziz Ibn Saud, who just is formerly known as Ibn Saud in history. He is the founder of Saudi Arabia. He establishes Saudi Arabia in 1932, 1934, is when the two kingdoms are united to create the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And he is the ruler until 1953 when he dies. So when he dies, his oldest son, I believe is his firstborn son, a guy named Saud, and this is not right here, but Saud bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, he becomes king. And so he is king from 1953 until 1964, until he is deposed by this guy, Faisal. And Faisal is the guy we've talked about.
If you're showing your screen, you have to do a screen share or something.
I'm sorry. It's a rookie move right there. I forgot to reshare my screen after the commercial break. Okay. So here's Saud. So this is Saud. So he becomes king. He's the first king after the founder of Saudi Arabia. MBS's grandfather dies. And this is, I believe he's the oldest son. He's born in 1902, which is effectively when the Muslim Brotherhood was created, and Ibn Saud begins his conquest of Saudi Arabia. He's deposed and this is where it's really interesting. This is where you really start to see the deviation from the Saudi royalty and the Saudi idea, the Arabian idea of aristocracy and monarchy, and how it contrasts with Europe. Because in Europe, you have the divine right of kings, where God has chosen this person to be king. He is therefore better than everybody else. He is God's chosen leader. He cannot be questioned, no matter how ruthless he is, no matter how awful he is as a leader. He's king, and you just have to suffer his will. That's not how it works in Arabia. It never has. It really is like a rule by consent, where the ruling oligarchy, so to speak, the leadership selects the leader, and if that leader fails to reflect the will of the tribe, of the group, then that leader is deposed and replaced. So Saud is basically, he's kind of an incompetent guy. He's not really like a super effective leader. He's not super charismatic. And so for those reasons, he's kind of led around by the nose by like the West, by the CIA, by Britain. And his brothers and his relatives all see this happening, and they're all increasingly frustrated by it. So in 1958, 5 years after he becomes king, Faisal convinces all the other relatives to make him prime minister. So he becomes prime minister, and basically goes about trying to enact economic reform, because they're having their economy is not exploding the way that it should. He actually has a secret meeting with JFK in 1960, and from that meeting, he establishes what's called the 10-point plan, which was a series of enactments that came about, including the creation of the council, which is kind of like the president's cabinet, but for Saudi Arabia. It does include the creation of like a system of governance that's loosely based on Sharia law, which obviously later, a good 20, 30 years later, would then be exacerbated and radicalized even further. But I think it's important to point out that, 1960, 1961, that's when Sharia law is brought to Saudi Arabia. It wasn't there before. So, which is really interesting when you think about it, because, MBS talks about 1979 being the year that really radicalized Saudi Arabia, and his detractors say that's not true. Those ideas and philosophies existed before then. Yes, that's true. They did exist before then. But 1960, 1961 is when the first system that's only loosely based on Sharia law is actually formally introduced to Saudi Arabia. And it's by Faisal. And I think a big driver of that is he's trying to distance himself and distance Saudi Arabia from the West. I think they're all very frustrated with the way that the CIA and the intelligence community are manipulating the Middle East, manipulating Saudi Arabia. And I think that's also why him and JFK seem to have some sort of a friendship or some sort of a common ground, because I think he understood that JFK was also not very happy with this group of people. By the way, also to come out of that agreement, JFK convinces Faisal to abolish slavery in Saudi Arabia. So he turns around and abolishes slavery as a direct result of that meeting with JFK.
That's fascinating. I'd love to read a book about this or something. I did not know about this communication and this arrangement between Faisal and JFK. The thing I would just add as a little contribution before you continue on the issue of Sharia law, there is a obviously we've seen the extreme terrible toxic expression of it in as far as like the Islamist radical version, but there is this current as well, going back a very long ways, of an idea of Sharia banking, which has been very, very interesting, let's just say, because it does base the idea that you can't lend it interest. If you're going to have a lending mechanism, it has to be tied to increasing production of the soil, of the land, of the people, and then that the person who gives a loan is sort of getting will receive kind of like it's like an investor almost, like you're going to receive a dividend in the returns on the investment in time. And you're not going to be just simply in a position of a loan shark who's just reaping the benefits of getting people into debt slavery. And the other idea too, of just having a basic set of moral values animating what is a legitimate form of economic value of an investment versus illegitimate. So you can't really make money off of investments into prostitution, drugs, things that are going to have a net negative effect on society. You're really only mandated to have legitimate value defined around things that are going to have a net positive effect upon a society morally and physically. So that those are like, you'll find like there are very reasonable historic currents and even people today who are pushing for Sharia banking, but they don't want to have like the full-blown Sharia law of like, you know, women have to be covered head to toe, so you can't see any flesh, any bit of skin beyond, you know, their the bridge of their nose or something like that. If even that, or they're not allowed to like vote or have, or slavery is okay. So
yeah.
It's important to have that nuance in mind.
And the other thing I'll point out too is that the whole idea when he did this, when Faisal did this, is he was trying to establish like a moral foundation for Saudi Arabia, the same way that the founding fathers of America viewed Christianity as the moral foundation of America.
Right.
And if you look in, like, I've done a lot more research into Islam, and I understand it better now than I did a few months ago. And you know, the four women of the four great women of Islam, they're actually called that, the four cornerstones, like cornerstone women of Islam, the four great women as they call them. That would be the Prophet Muhammad's wife, first wife, who he was monogamous with. He didn't take another wife until she died. Married for 25 years. She was older than him. She was a very rich, wealthy widow. He was a poor, illiterate orphan. And she basically took him in, put him through a series of tests because she didn't know if he was worthy of marriage, and made him prove himself to her. So she she almost like wore the pants in their relationship, which is like a really interesting thing to read about. She also was like very, very, she was very, very charitable. She was very, very gracious. She was all about clothing and feeding the poor. She really embraced the concept of Hashim, Muhammad's grandfather. Hashim, that name means he who feeds the starving. She embraced that and said, this needs to be like the essence of Islam needs to be a part, like this has to be about Islam, like what Islam's about. Just like Christianity is about charity, Islam also needs to be about charity. So that's also a part of Sharia law. The other three women, by the way, Fatima, who is the daughter of Muhammad and this woman, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Pharaoh's wife of Egypt at the time. So interesting though, the Virgin Mary is considered one of the most important women in Islam. So I just think that's another. It's a lovely
irony.
It is.
Yeah, it's a glorious irony.
It is. So anyway, so we are back here and we're talking about Faisal. So Faisal, he is a really interesting character. I actually, if you look, this picture of him is not very this is like when he's younger, 1945. In the 70s, he's much older. He has almost kind of like this. He looks like he's sent from Central Casting, like Hollywood, as like the Arab villain. Like he has this kind of villainous face. So I think a lot of people like saw pictures of him and thought that he was someone who couldn't be trusted. But really, he was kind of a nationalist and a populist nationalist at that. In 1919, which is a date we've talked about a lot on the show, at the end of World War I, his older brother was supposed to be sent to London to negotiate with the West. He gets Spanish flu and dies. So his father, the founder of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, sends Faisal in his stead. Faisal is 13 years old. He's the first Saudi Arabian royal family member to ever visit England, and he arrives as a 13-year-old kid to basically negotiate on behalf of Saudi Arabia. So he is thrust from a very young age, and I will let me see. He is thrust from a very young age, like into the limelight, into a position of leadership. Let me just show this picture. This is the picture of him at 13 on his way to England. So he's a young kid, and then actually 3 years later, he actually leads a military campaign on horseback at the age of 16. So this kid, I mean, he is a leader of men at a very young age, and a very capable one at that. So he becomes prime minister. He meets with JFK. He continues to be frustrated with his brother, and so he resigns in protest in the early 60s, and then is later convinces his relatives to have him reinstalled as prime minister. And then in 1964, they all collectively depose Saud and say, you have to step down and abdicate the throne. You're just not up to this challenge right now. So Saud abdicates the throne. Faisal becomes king in 1964, and he rules for 11 years. So, and this again is on the heels of JFK being assassinated. So then let's fast forward to 1970. So 1970, you start to have, well, really 1968, you have in the 60s, you start to have these issues with the U.S. dollar, the Bretton Woods system. Why don't you talk about the Bretton Woods system, and I will grab some water, and then we can kind of jump into
yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start talking about the Bretton Woods system and Nixon and why that's important. Why don't you just give a little background about the Bretton Woods system, what it is, and how it came to be?
Yeah, most certainly. So this is going to be an important component of the scaffolding of this period of history as far as building up the stage and setting the tone of the drama, because one of the big reasons why the U.S. dollar became weaponized is the destruction of the fixed exchange rate gold reserve system in 1971. So the same year the World Economic Forum is being brought online. It's a very important year. It's the year that the Inter-Alpha group of banks under Jacob Rothschild's, umbrella octopus series of what became about 13 major banks internationally was also established at this moment in 1971. The Trilateral Commission was being prepared. The scaffolding for that was being set up in 1971. The takeover of this, you could call it the deep state. You still had a lot more patriotic elements inside of American intelligence that had been still working with people like John F. Kennedy earlier that were still pushing a bit of a resistance against this Rhodes Scholar Fabian takeover. That was there was a big point of consummation of the takeover of this more evil element in 1971 that set the stage for the Trilateral Commission. So the thing that weaponized the U.S. dollar was separating the dollar from any metric of physical value. So that was known as the Bretton Woods system. Now, there were Bretton Woods mechanisms that continued after that point, but the thing that made the Bretton Woods system viable was the fixed exchange rate structure. So that was set up in 1945 or 44 at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, with the various nations. I think there were 65 or 66 allied nations who all participated. And the idea was what was going to be the framework of the operating system after World War II. Let me jump back ahead to 1971, right? By allowing the dollar to float onto the global like the floating exchange markets, that floating of the dollar made it very susceptible to the fluctuations of speculation on the spot markets, on the futures markets, where speculators who don't care about physical reality or production, they just want to make money with money. That all of a sudden became the dominant force and what determined the value when you saw, okay, the US dollar is worth how much today on the New York Stock Exchange or whatever. And it also, because of that volatility, it made it impossible to think about long-term planning, because now you don't know what the price of the dollar is going to be in 5 months, let alone 5 years. And you need to have a relative amount of stability to think, okay, if we're going to build a hydroelectric dam or a nuclear power plant or something of like vital infrastructure, you got to have a 5-10 year orientation into the future. That means you need to have some kind of relative stability to convince investors like, hey, this project is something that will bear a return, and it's good, and the US dollar is going to be stable enough to guarantee that it's going to be built, right? And then that also made it susceptible to be then tied, as Kissinger did, to the price of oil, because everybody all of a sudden, well, since Bretton Woods, every nation had the US dollar as the basis of their settlements of their balance of payments, their trade deals, everything. So the idea was not a bad idea originally, because the US came out as an economy super strong after World War I. It was the only country that had a really strong, productive renaissance throughout in the build-up to, and especially during the war. So it became known that the US dollar is as good as gold, if not better. And it's kind of true, because to the degree that you have an economy which is focused and vectored on abundance, on creating real wealth in the real world, and that investment is tied to that and not just speculating on debt, then yeah, it's good that everybody has reserves of US dollars, and they use these reserves as the basis of their settlements and trade. And increasingly after the 70s and 73, it became oil. And you're going to talk about that. I know you will. But and what do you got there is the Bretton Woods US dollar at the center, rates, right, are of 1955. Okay. Yeah. What's this?
Yeah. So basically, the crux of like Bretton Woods is that after World War II, there was an agreement that that the world was going to peg the currency to gold. So the U.S. dollar was going to be as good as gold. It was pegged to the value of gold, and then everyone else's currency was basically like the rates of exchange were all kind of compared and set by its relative value to a U.S. dollar. And so here you have in 1955, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Canada, and you can see how they all fluctuate. You can see how 360 yen for $1 in Japan, 3.5 francs for $1 in France, etc. So
yeah,
come 1968, the economies are all starting to experience a lot of turmoil. And what happens is, I think the first one was Charles de Gaulle in France, was the first person to come and say, you know what, we actually want our gold. We want to exchange our US dollars for gold. And I think there was $14 billion US dollars in circulation. And what I read was it cost the United States 10 cents to make itself a $100 bill, but for every foreign nation who wanted the $100 bill had to provide $100 worth of material goods, right? So whether that's 625 lire or 3.5 francs or what have you, they had to actually give something up to get that $100 bill versus the United States didn't. So they are exchanging their money, their U.S. dollars for gold. There's about $14 billion in circulation worldwide at that point. And the Federal Reserve only has, I think, like 3.5, maybe $3.9 billion in gold. Mm-hmm. And so there was this big concern that there was going to be this run on gold. And all of a sudden, all these other countries start saying, all right, yeah, I want to do the same thing. I want my gold. Like, give us the gold. Like, we don't want these US dollars anymore. And so that causes like a big panic in DC, because this is creating inflation and could really have catastrophic consequences for the United States. So Nixon does what's called the Nixon shock in 1971. Where they meet in private. They have private meetings where he's consulting with a bunch of different experts. And Treasury Secretary John Connally convinces him to temporarily suspend the gold, like detach the US dollar from the gold standard. The logic being that if we do this, we will stop this run on gold that's happening worldwide. No one's going to want to come and ask for the gold if our dollar is not pegged to the value of gold. Does that make sense? So they close the gold window. August 15th, which is a Sunday, Nixon takes the stage. He explains everything to the American people about what's about to happen. The three major things are, as I just said, temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Executive Order 11615, the Economic Stabilization Act of 1970, which is a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to counter inflation. It was the first time that the U.S. government had done that since World War II. And then this is a really important part: an import surcharge of 10% to protect American products and American manufacturing. So anything coming into the United States had a 10% tariff on it. Doesn't matter what it is, right? So this is really important, because this is August 1971. 4 months later, that is reversed. So 4 months later, they quietly remove that third part. So 4 months later, they take away the 10% tariff. And in December 1971, these foreign countries could start shipping all their goods back in without like any barrier for entry. You also have what's called the Group of 10. And what happened, this is in December 1971, and these 10 countries meet, and they agree that, let me get the list of countries, which I thought I had grabbed that, maybe I didn't. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So the Smithsonian Agreement is how it's known, but it's Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and then Switzerland was also added later as the 11th country. And basically, they all agreed that their currency is going to be pegged to the U.S. dollar. So instead of pegging their currency to gold or pegging or whatever, they then peg it to the U.S. dollar. And then this creates what is known as you have floating currencies and open market operation. And basically, what this means is open market operation means that when country, and basically every country has a floating currency now, which means their currency is not pegged to a material good like gold. And that then allows governments to institute other means of fiscal policy and monetary policy, such as selling government bonds, such as quantitative easing. And so what happens is that you have these commercial banking loans that lead to the financial collapse of 2008, the financial crisis of 2008. And then after the financial crisis of 2008, that's when we get the quantitative easing, which is basically just money printing, right?
Yep.
So this is interesting, and I apologize for using Wikipedia, but sometimes Wikipedia is concise. So as long as the information that you're conveying is fact checked, it can be a useful, concise resource. So the ramifications of the Nixon shock and like the detaching of the U.S. dollar to the gold standard, as listed here, the economic failure, like initially it was considered a political success, but then there was the failure was that there was a big recession in 1973, 1975. We've all heard the term stagflation. The older people that I've worked with, like the architects and construction guys I've worked with who talk about the 70s, say the 70s was like the scariest time to be alive. People legitimately thought the world was going to end. The dollar plunged by a third in value, like during that decade. They were experiencing stagflation the same way we are today, but they didn't have the internet, so they couldn't really go out and get like knowledge or information. And then even Paul Volcker, who was involved in this whole situation, he was a part of all this. I believe he was the Federal Reserve Chairman at the time. He expresses regret over the abandonment of Bretton Woods in 2011 and says nobody's in charge now. The Europeans couldn't live with the uncertainty and made their own currency, and now that's in trouble. And he's talking about the euro. So basically, you have all this currency manipulation happening all over the world. You have everyone trying to game the system to improve their personal position, and it just turns the global economy into like this free for all where like the Wild West, and that leads to a lot of really bad terrible inflation and terrible geopolitical conditions ever since the 70s. So fast forward now to 2 years to 1973, and we have what is the Yom Kippur War. And so the Yom Kippur War was where you had Arab actors who attacked Israel on October 6th, Yom Kippur, on the first day of Yom Kippur, and then that led to Israel, which had already, like during the 6-Day War in 1967, they had already occupied militarily. They had occupied the West Bank, and that causes them to then start bombing Syria, start bombing Lebanon, and in response to the Yom Kippur War, like you have Israel now at war with the Arabs, who are being backed by Jordan, and then the U.S. and Britain and Canada and France, they all come in behind Israel and they're backing Israel. And so in response to that escalation, where you have the West now coming in to back Israel, as was probably expected, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia suspends the sale of oil to the West. And anyone who was alive at the time, who's listening right now, probably remembers I think gas went up 300%. It was like 300% increase in the price of gas. You had gas like stamps, like vouchers that were issued. There was a rationing. People couldn't get fuel. Like you had to wait in line. Like there's stories about people waiting in line for hours just to fill up their car. It was a real problem. And so this this oil embargo lasts for about 6 months. It starts, like I said, in October of 1973, and then it gets resolved around March or April of 1974. And how does it get resolved? Well, Nixon sends Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia to meet with Faisal and negotiate a resolution. And what they come up with is the petrodollar. Now, preparing for this show, I actually learned something interesting about the petrodollar. Apparently, in post-World War II, there was something called the petrodollar. And what that was going back to the Bretton Woods system, every single country, because they all had these reserves of US dollars, they had too many US dollars effectively. And so what would happen is there was so much, in a good way, there was so many US dollars in circulation, not because we had overprinted, just because we were doing so much business, that these dollars were basically being taken out of the economy because these countries couldn't spend the money fast enough. They couldn't buy enough oil. They couldn't spend it quick enough. And so effectively, these dollars were sidelined, and that caused deflation in America. And actually, our purchasing power went up. And so those dollars that were sitting on the sideline were called petrodollars. That's what apparently they were referred to. This is like in the late 40s. And so I think Kissinger like resurrected that. It had a very positive connotation. Like a petrodollar was a good thing because it meant that a US dollar was being deflated and going up in value. And so I think Kissinger took that idea and said, okay, we're going to call this the petrodollar, almost in like an inversion of like that idea. And they wanted to make sure that that the US dollar was stable and that it was effectively pegged to something without literally or actually pegging it to something. And it became pegged to oil. And so the agreement was that in exchange for selling oil only in US dollars, requiring everyone in the world to first convert their currency to US dollars before they purchase the oil from Saudi Arabia, from OPEC. In exchange, if they did that, we would militarily protect Saudi Arabia. We would also sell them a bunch of military equipment. We happen to have an enormous surplus of military equipment because of the Vietnam War. We had like ramped up our production, and the war was kind of winding down at this point, and people were sick of it. And so because of that, the military industrial complex had all this equipment that they couldn't get rid of. And now they had a buyer in Saudi Arabia. And so they said, yes, we will sell you this military equipment if you agree to this deal. And so they did. And that really is what started that decision. The petrodollar in 1973 is what started where we are now, and what has basically led to the moment that we are right now. The bookend of it is the 1973 petrodollar deal. And the other bookend is going to be, I think, 2024, the emergence of BRICS, the economic crisis we're in right now, the de-dollarization, as they're saying, the world pivoting away from the dollar. And right now, I think there's more. I think there's, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I think between Russia and China, they're now doing the majority of all their oil deals in rubles and yuan, as opposed to dollars. And it represents a real threat to not necessarily the United States, but the US dollar for sure, and the interests that use the fiat dollar as a weapon. And it is a weapon. I mean, that was the real thing that happened with the creation of the petrodollar was Kissinger and them took the US dollar, which was considered like the thing, the currency in the world at the time, and they weaponized it against the rest of the world. That's what the petrodollar represented. And it's also worth pointing out that year, Kissinger, shortly after this deal was negotiated, resigned as Secretary of State because of Watergate. So he actually resigned in 1974 because of Watergate, left Nixon out to dry, and there's a whole different rabbit hole to go down about Watergate and what it actually was. But yeah, so Kissinger walks away from the State Department, and Brzezinski had just started the Trilateral Commission the year before with Kissinger, so that allowed Kissinger to kind of pivot more towards this transnational cartel that they were creating, using the Trilateral Commission, using the World Economic Forum, using those kind of NGO type organizations, these transnational organizations where these oligarchs could collude with one another to subvert the sovereignty of individual nation states.
Yeah, the idea of liberal imperialism, the globalist variation of the same thing, because people often think, oh, Dick Cheney and the neocons and Clinton and the Rhodes Scholars, they're two different things. And it's like, no, we now know it's all the uniparty, but we could see how this was artificially created as a piece of theater. And even today, there are scholars who think that Zbigniew Brzezinski was a rival to Kissinger. They actually think that this is a belief that's prevalent. And there were like disputes that were made public between the two regarding like the orientation of what America would be going into the thing both of them openly extolled, which was this New World Order post-national structure of global government. But there were tag teaming different elements of the great game. So on the one hand, yeah, Zbigniew brought in things like Team B under Gerald Ford and then Carter, right? He brought in the whole trilateral, which, by the way, both of them are high-level trilateral commission members. But Team B is brought in, which has people like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, all of these groups, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, are all brought in by Zbigniew Brzezinski under Carter, first Ford and then especially Carter. And this whole purging of the CIA, there were two purges, one under Schlesinger back in 1969 that purged the patriotic elements, or many of the patriotic elements within the CIA that were trying to raise the alarm bells about what the U.S. had been infiltrated by, things like the inside job operation around the murder of Bobby Kennedy, other things as well. That was purged. And then there was a second purge overseen by Zbigniew Brzezinski when he was able to produce a bit of a coup during the same time, whereby his analysts under Paul Wolfowitz and Pearl and Paul Neitz were brought in with their analysis saying that no, American intelligence, conventional American intelligence is wrong because they presume that we can somehow have peace and collaboration around industrial development and scientific discoveries with the Soviets. And this is around the same time, right, where you had Apollo-Soyuz, the meeting of Russian and American astronauts as a real scientific and cultural peace-building process. You had a similar discussion happening regarding pro-industrial elements in China as well, saying, hey, let's deal with weapons of mass destruction, or the entire idea of MAD, of mutually assured destruction. Let's deal with that by creating a new structure of cooperation and leaping beyond the limits to growth. And let's not presume that China or Russia want to dominate the world and destroy us. Let's presume that they don't want to do that, because honestly, they didn't. They wanted security. And as Putin said in his speech, it's the same kind of desire. They just want some sense of security guarantees to not be attacked. That's all they want. But then this Team B grouping said, no, we have to bring in the Rand Corporation paranoid view that, no, Russia actually wants to destroy us, destroy Europe, destroy everybody. And that's why we need to pour in money into funding radicalizing madrasas as part of like a weaponization of Islam, as part of a way to get Russia into an unwinnable quagmire. That's why we need to fund even more nuclear bombs with new delivery capabilities. That's why we need to have more of the military industrial complex rewarded, because we're going to just assume that our rivals want to destroy us rather than, and that's why we're also going to cancel all diplomatic bridge building. We're going to cancel the Apollo-Soyuz project. We're just going to erase that. Any point of collaboration on technology, we're going to erase that. And so, Zbigniew oversaw the growth of this neocon parasite inside of the heart of the Republican Party and Democratic Party at the same time. Kissinger, who was trained by Rhodes Scholar William Yandell Elliott and was part of the Bilderberger group since the 1950s. He was part of the whole Rockefeller apparatus. He was then brought on, as you just said, to start working to establish through one of his students new globalist institutions like Davos under Klaus Schwab, who was his student, and to bring in a new agenda for essentially what became the consumer society, right? We were told all of a sudden in the early 70s, okay, the new logic, the new morality is we are going to be a consumer post-industrial society. The obsolete ethic for economic value of the 50s, the 40s, the 60s, that was based on production of dirty things in industries and that, and we're beyond that. We're going to go into the ideas economy now. So we're not going to produce things that we consume. We're going to be a consumer society where being a good citizen means being a good shopper. And we're going to export our factories to poor countries to use their cheap labor in sweatshops. And that's where the China element came in for Kissinger. And his assignment was not only the NSSM 200, program to convert U.S. foreign policy towards promoting depopulation, saying, look, we'll give you money, we'll give you aid, but on the condition that you impose population restrictions in Sri Lanka, or you don't build energy-intensive dam projects like you wanted to in South America, or you don't build this XYZ, whatever, in Africa, and instead you build appropriate technologies. We'll let you use the money as long as you obey these conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank, which will involve privatizing a big chunk of your economy, making sure private oligarchs are enriched and Western corporations will run your nation, and that you don't actually invest in things that will benefit your people by allowing for them to industrialize. We won't allow that. So that was like part of the whole thing. And China was like the key thing, because that was like the biggest growth potential. And if you could get China to accept the taking on or being rewarded with getting factories, but at the expense of having zero population programs, like was done with the Club of Rome models that Kissinger ensured were brought into China in 1979-80, all of a sudden, they're going to self-mutilate. And the idea was China was supposed to be the forever slave society of cheap labor, where they will have an enriched local oligarchy in Hong Kong and Shanghai that will oversee the slave society as a whole with no internal development, nothing like the Silk Road, nothing like the Belt and Road Initiative. That was not permitted. It was only going to be port town industrial hub that will not be tied to an internal, program of national development. Even David Rockefeller had a whole program in China, a conference in 1982, basically saying, no, this is not permitted. You're not allowed to build rail the way Lincoln did during the Civil War or after the Civil War. You're not allowed to do that. The agreement was sweatshops, and we will give you money, but the masses, 99%, would stay too poor to buy the things that they produced, and that the rest would just go to an increasingly decadent, overbloated, corrupted Western population that would lose the capacity to produce for themselves, to wipe their own butts. And increasingly, we became addicted to this cheap labor, and we kind of got corrupted. We really did get corrupted. And a little bit of this has to be there. I think this is an important time that we're living in now of self-examination, self-reflection, because we lost our values, the value of producing for the next generation. That was what made capitalism work. That's what made the Bretton Woods system viable, was that we had an ethic of cherishing the family, God, our nation, and thinking about what we build for, or what we leave after we die for the next generations. That was like, that works. That's what JFK was invoking. His brother was invoking that. And that's what Kissinger and Zbigniew and all of these creeps like Volcker from the Trilateral Commission consciously wanted to destroy by creating this petrodollar insanity and weaponizing the US dollar, which is exactly what Putin was speaking to, saying, look, there's one West. And I've heard him give speeches, Vladimir Putin, saying, look, there's two Wests. One is a West of beautiful Renaissance traditions and Christianity. And that's a West we want to work with. That's the West that he thought he was talking to in 1999-2000, when he was offering to jointly create a ballistic missile shield, as he described with Tucker Carlson, saying, look, we were willing to co-build this thing with America. We were even open to the discussion of getting Russia to join NATO. We were that open to that because we thought we were speaking to a different kind of America. We now realize 20 years later that we were very wrong. There's this other more satanic thing that smells like sulfur, calling itself Christian and democratic, but it's really not that at all. But he has been trying, as has Xi Jinping, as has many leaders of the world that we've been taught to hate and fear. If you actually read their writings and look at their speeches and listen to them, they've been trying to speak to the better side of us, hoping to God that we can get our shit back and start like de-weaponizing our dollar, restoring our values, fighting against this deep state that also wants to destroy them too. They've had their own battles with their own deep state structures that have been built up over a long time inside of Russia. That's what Putin went to war with when he became president. That's the thing that took over in the 1990s under Perestroika in Russia. That's what Anatoly Chubais represents when he set up Davos in Moscow or St. Petersburg. There was this whole billionaire clique that wanted to insert themselves and take over Russia from within, the way Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about, which would involve breaking up Russia into a balkanized series of 13 or 14 micro states of ethno-nationalist dominant groupings, all under the control of the World Bank and the IMF and Davos. And the same thing for China. They had their own. That's what Jack Ma is. And Jack Ma, people say, oh, they're so anti-capitalist. They didn't let their private entrepreneur Jack Ma have the freedom to do what he wants as an entrepreneur. And it's like, who the hell is Jack Ma? He's a Bill Gates of China who's a trustee of the World Economic Forum who called for an economic coup in China because to bring in some weird variation of some Davos digital currency to undermine the Bank of China. And of course, they took him down. They basically said, you're allowed to teach high school now. and you're not allowed to do anything anymore except teach high school. And even that probably is too much. So China's been dealing with their own deep state in Shanghai and Hong Kong. And yeah, man, I mean, it's interesting how there's really a time for reckoning and self-reflection going on right now.
Well, there's some interesting points. I mean, the point about the two West, I think that's really important to remember. As over the next 12 months, as you hear the panic and the exasperated desperation of the media talking about the threat all of these different events and developments represent to the West and to America, what they're really talking about is the threat that it represents to our enemy, like the pedophile crime syndicate, as I call it now. I mean, that's pretty much the only word I can come up with for it. I mean, a deep state, whatever. That is what's being destroyed right now. It's not America, like us, like we as a people are not being destroyed. The system that has exploited the entire world and is now exploiting its own people, the American people, that is what's being destroyed. And it's important to remember that. And that leads into the second point, which is all of these foreign nations, Russia, China, Iran, all these different countries, Saudi Arabia, Africa, that you're hearing about now, they've all been exploited at one point over the past few centuries by this Western hegemony. They've all been exploited. They've all been abused. They've all been taken advantage of. They understand, for the most part, what that is, the threat that it is, and how and why. That's why they all have, like, they're all on the same page. They all understand we have a common enemy. And if we put aside our differences and focus on cooperation, we can defeat this common enemy finally and actually bring prosperity to the world and create conditions for world peace. So with that said, I want to play this video because I thought this was pretty well done. It has footage and stuff from this time. It's only about a minute long, and then they start talking about something else. I'll cut it off. And then I want to look at an article from 1972 to kind of demonstrate to everyone what we're talking about. And then should we do ad reads before that?
Let's watch this video.
Okay.
Actually, you know what? Yeah. Let's do this. We'll
do the ad reads and then we'll watch the video.
Yeah, because now that people have an idea of where we want to go, or where we're going, they're going to want to stay on, and it's good. It's a good cliffhanger. So yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, let's do that. All right, let me.
So you want to do the ad reads, or?
Okay. Yep. Let me pull it up real quick. I didn't pull up the spreadsheet, but I have it right now, and we are on. We've done Ascent. We've done
Aerotags.
My Pillow. Right, I have not received my AirTag yet, but I believe there's one on the way. Yep, here we go. All right, hit play.
Yeah, okay.
Tired of the endless cycle of buying and tossing those paper tree air fresheners? Enter AirTags, where their dream was to craft a solution to this very problem. AirTags are the first ever laser engraved rescindable car air fresheners made right here in the USA. Born in the makerspace of the Cleveland Public Library, AirTags is not just a business, it's a revolution, a testament to the American dream. They are not just about freshening your space, but about doing it better with a commitment to longevity, aesthetics, and sustainability. AirTags are designed to last longer, look great, and reduce waste, replacing those fleeting scents with something you can count on. Don't forget to grab your Badlands Media AirTag, now available. Visit badlandsmedia.tv/AirTags. That's AROTAGS, and use promo code Badlands for 10% off your order. That's badlandsmedia.tv/AirTags, promo code Badlands.
Great.
All right.
Okay.
Last
one. Next one is
Beamish Metalworks. All right. Attention Badlanders. In the heart of Malmo, Minnesota, a remarkable family-led team at Beamish Metalworks is crafting not just metal art, but personalized, timeless masterpieces. Beamish Metalworks is in a class of its own, pioneering metal on wood creations. Imagine a piece of art that's not confined by generic designs, but is a narrative of your persona, your memories, or your dreams. From the elegance of an office centerpiece to the wild spirit of hunting and fishing scenes, your imagination is the only limit. Dive into the realm of endless possibilities with Beamish customization, where your space becomes a reflection of you with the distinct vibe that only Beamish Metalworks can offer. Beamish Metalworks proudly supports local heroes and events, from veteran fundraisers to law enforcement gatherings, and embedding ourselves as a pillar of support and gratitude. Visit Beamish Metalworks today at badlandsmedia.tv/metalart and use promo code Badlands for 10% off your one-of-a-kind purchase. That's badlandsmedia.tv/metalart, promo code Badlands.
cool technology. Interesting.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, it's awesome. Okay, so can you see? Let me reshare. I gotta reshare my screen.
Yep.
And it is this one. All right, so this is about a minute long video, and then I'll cut it off. Tell me if you
Okay.
can't hear sound.
The vast oil-rich deserts of Saudi Arabia.
In the 70s, after the Arab crisis happened with the oil embargoes, OPEC basically tripled the price of oil to the Western world. And at that time, America realized that they were vulnerable because they were importing about 70% of all the oil they consumed.
To secure a reliable foreign source of oil, U.S. President Richard Nixon sent his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia for a secret meeting. The result was a pact that still stands to this day.
If Saudi Arabia, which at the time was the world's largest producer of oil, would sell the oil in US dollars, America would defend Saudi Arabia and make sure the House Assad would stay in power.
As a direct result of this U.S.-Saudi agreement, all other oil-producing nations also adopted the dollar as the de facto medium of exchange. Demand for it increased exponentially all over the world, and soon it had a new name, the petrodollar.
Your currency is only as strong as the demand for it, just like anything else, the supply and demand. Why the petrodollar is important, it causes a demand for the US dollar. A lot of Americans don't realize that over 70% of all the $100 bills in the world are actually outside of the US. There's more $100 bills in Russia than there are in America.
This stockpile of U.S. dollars in countries around the world is because oil is bought and sold using the greenback.
If oil starts trading.
All right, so really the biggest reason I wanted to play that was just that one line where he says, in exchange, the U.S. will make sure that will protect the House of Saud and make sure they remain in power. Because I actually think this is something I mentioned before, and this is just my own theory. This isn't something that I've read elsewhere, so I could be wrong. But I think that a decision was made because of the way Faisal was acting, because of like his meeting with JFK. He was murdered, by the way, a year later in 1975 by his nephew, who had just returned from Virginia, and people thought that maybe he was MK Ultra'd by the CIA. I actually think that they realized how unstable the reliance on Saudi Arabia was, because all it took was one guy to become king who didn't like them. And he could affect like MBS, and he could undo the entire like U.S. economy and undo the whole global hegemony, which is why I think they decided to pivot to Iran, bring Iran online, but then also use Iran to radicalize Saudi Arabia and make it even more radical. So then they would be like an arms race between who was the most orthodox Islam culture, the Shia in Iran or the Sunni in Saudi Arabia. So that I think is really what started this whole like pivot. And Brzezinski, if you listen to the rhetoric of Brzezinski and I've been reading like his writings and stuff, he never talks about Saudi Arabia. He only talks about Iran. He talks about how like Iran is like everything, and Iran is like the future of the Middle East, and their alliance with or speculating on a potential alliance with China and Russia, and how that could undo everything that they've worked so hard to build. So I don't know. There's some fascinating things that I think are going on, but yeah, I wanted to play that because of that one thing. I'll give you a chance to respond before I go. I'll share this article.
Yeah, no, I think it's great, and your insight into the radicalization of the Shia Iran and the Sunni, forcing sort of the situation of Sunni Saudi Arabia to also match suit, keep pace with that as an eye for an eye thing. With again, Kissinger and Zbigniew always in the same dance, but with two different set of steps that they've been told by their handlers. I mean, they are grand strategists themselves. I don't want to undercut their intelligence, but let's be honest, they themselves also are devoted to a managerial program that is even above them. This is what has been sort of shaping the contours of the construction of the global British Empire, which is where Kissinger had even said in 1981 at his Chatham House speech, how during his time as Secretary of State, he kept the British Foreign Office far more briefed and informed than his own State Department in America. And that was at a Chatham House, aka, roundtable movement event in May 10th, 1981. And Zbigniew, his whole life was essentially devoted to the cause of global empire and as he calls it, the technotronic era, right? Like America between two ages. And in it, he literally goes through his devotion to an ideal future that would involve no individuality, would look a lot like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, of an age where you have mass surveillance, no nation states, and a scientific dictatorship, which both of them ultimately believed in, even though they had different assignments. So what you're saying regarding the fight by King Faisal to revive a spirit of real technological growth and leaping beyond the limits of the growth in conjunction with other nations, and how Kissinger infused with Zbigniew this very dangerous undercutting of that by spreading radicalization programs of madrasas, again, to destroy the culture, and then to create also this handicapped Saudi Arabia and UAE. So on the one, just by having a society that won't be allowed to modernize, to have industry, which Saudi Arabia wasn't allowed to do because they were told, just like China was told, look, your elites will get a lot of money by you just doing this one thing. For China, it was sweatshops. For Saudi Arabia, you are going to be a monocropper of oil. Oil revenues will be all you need to do. You'll make so much money. You don't need nuclear power. You don't need rail development. You don't need any industry. But at the same time, that makes them, on the one hand, have a society that's highly impoverished because most people are not going to benefit by that. So there's a lot of impoverishment, a very corrupt or decadent upper class that becomes more decadent, just like our society did under a consumer society every single year. And now you see that there is this effort to try. Here, I actually have a little image here. This is like something which is real. Like this is actually being discussed. And this is the Schiller Institute that composited all of the different projects that have been built or are being built in and around Saudi Arabia. And you just look at it. This is like MBS and his allies are working with the Belt and Road Initiative and this new paradigm of development to build things like the Trans-Arabian high-speed railway, which is under construction now. The connection up. This is already like engineering feasibility studies have already been done on this. Funds have been allocated towards this. As far as the connection of Saudi Arabia through that would connect into Jordan and into Egypt as part of the Mediterranean Red Sea high-speed rail line that is also being built by Egypt right now. There's also discussion to connect up rail lines between the new port of Sayed, which is being built with the help of French and Russian industrial groupings in north of Egypt with nuclear power that would connect that down into Sudan and further down into Ethiopia as well. We already have the line built up by the Chinese up into the port of Djibouti, and another port is going to be built up into Somaliland as well, giving another point of access to the Red Sea and this broader Gulf. Down to Kenya, there's other similar things, and all across Yemen, there's discussions that have been underway for over 15 years, which have been renewed since the peace process brokered by China between Yemen and Saudi Arabia was initiated last year. There's now a renewed discussion to bring back this construction of a rail line and oil pipelines across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in Yemen as part of a Yemeni reconstruction and industrial push that would connect all the way across into Oman, into UAE, which also has their own pro-nuclear, pro-rail development as part of the BRICS. Iran, obviously, as part of the BRICS, as well as Egypt. These are all BRICS nations, right? UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, they're all BRICS. That's so important for people to hold this in mind. And Ethiopia is now part of the BRICS. I mean, Saudi Arabia, it's a little bit slow, but they're going to be getting on board. And it is this wonderful conjunction into Zbigniew Brzezinski's nightmare scenario of the thing that must never happen is now happening. And it's lovely. Yes. It's just a lovely thing.
It is. It's fascinating. And no, that's great. And so I want to share this article real quick before I just want to react a little bit. So Faisal, who I think is a really important figure, MBS, like you said, is doing So he presented this idea to Obama in 2015. He said he called it at the time Vision 2030, which is what he calls it now. But he said, look, I want to build high-speed railroad. I want to basically make us a tech-based society. Like, I want to be a tech-based economy in Saudi. I want to pivot away from oil. And all these grand plans. He went into the White House and explained all this to Obama, not as Crown Prince, but as, I'm not even sure if he was, he might have been the defense minister at that point. But if not, he was just an advisor to his father. Obama literally laughed him out of the room and was like, this kid's like, who's this kid think he is? Like, he's not going to do any of this stuff. They're bluffing. Obama literally turned to his advisors afterwards. This is reported by CIA shills, Ben Hubbard. He turned to him and said, look into what they're doing. They're hiding something, obviously. Like, the fact that they're bluffing and they're saying they're going to do all this stuff, which they're obviously not going to do. Look into what they're really doing, because obviously they're hiding something. Very suspicious of him. And that was also when MBS corrected Obama, because Obama started lecturing him about Wahhabism. And he was like, you actually don't really know much about our culture, but if you'd like, I could arrange for a tutor to come here and educate you, so you actually know what you're talking about. And everyone was like, holy shit, this like 28-year-old kid just spoke like that to the president of the United States. I mean, what's not to love about MBS? Real quick, so Faisal, I actually think that MBS, like he points out 1979, he's the one who put that in my mind's eye about the 1979 thing and how that was a major pivot point. I actually think that he views what he's doing right now as a continuation. I mean, I'm just kind of speculating, but I think he probably views what he's doing right now as a continuation as what Faisal was doing. Faisal, by the way, one of the 10 points that he enacted coming out of the meeting with JFK was bringing like healthcare and services, like human services, to the people, which would be funded by the government, like by the royal family. And while some people might say, well, that sounds like communism, it was JFK who inspired him to do this. And JFK was like the guy who was fighting against communism. So I don't think that's what it was. And by the way, the Arabs opposed communists and opposed Soviet for the most part for much of the Cold War, because a tenet of communism is anti-religion. And so they didn't like that aspect of it. So that was a big reason why, like, the more extreme societies never really got on board with the Soviets, was because communism was anti-religion. Also wanted to point out that his son, Faisal's son, Turki bin Faisal, he was the director of Saudi intelligence from 1979. There's that date again, until 2001. He resigned 10 days before 9/11. And I can't, after 22 years of running this organization, I can't help but wonder if he knew something and he didn't want to be involved. And he's like, I'm resigning. After 22 years, he just like suddenly resigns and walks away. And he was the guy that MBS handpicked to go out and speak and address the world after the October 7th attack. He was the one who went out there and said, there are no heroes in this conflict. We don't think anybody's a good guy. Both Hamas and Israel are wrong. Which is like a very, very fascinating rhetoric. The whole, like, all the analysts and stuff were like, wow, this is very unexpected rhetoric coming from Saudi Arabia. Okay, so now I want to share this article, and this is really just to demonstrate to everyone what we're talking about when we talk about, how the CIA manipulates all of us. Okay, and I shared this on Badlands Daily before, so if you've seen that, this might look familiar. This is from 1972, December 1972, so right in the same time frame that we've been talking about in this episode. It's the title is "Egypt is Caught in a Red Trap." This is from the Baltimore News American newspaper, and I'm not going to read the whole article, but I just want to point out there are a few places where the article starts by saying, our Central Intelligence Agency reports that the Kremlin is now feeding the Egyptian armed forces through a cage. Moscow is quietly shut down on the supply of spare parts that make these forces functional. And it goes on to explain how all these strings that are happening in the Middle East at the time are being pulled by the Kremlin and are being pulled by the Soviets. And there might have been some truth to that, maybe. But almost every paragraph begins with, according to the CIA. According to the CIA, according to the CIA. The CIA says this, the CIA says that. by the way, guys, this is exactly how they report the news now, except instead of saying according to the CIA, they say according to anonymous sources, according to sources familiar with the matter, according to people who didn't want to be named. They're talking about the CIA, guys. It's just back before in 1972, everyone thought the CIA was a hero organization. So they were very brazen about being like, well, here's what the CIA is saying. Like, what do y'all think? And now they know they can't say it that way because people will say, well, wait a minute, the CIA, like these guys are a bunch of pedophile criminals. Like, we can't listen to what these guys say.
Yeah, right. No, it's true, right? Because it was still we would still have to wait 2 more years after this article before the Church Committee was formed and released all of the MK Ultra CIA Project Mockingbird information to the public. People didn't know about that yet, which proved that basically most. Huh?
I'm sorry. Finish your thought. I was just going to read this one paragraph. It's actually.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, which basically proved that most of the news editors in televised and print media were all CIA stenographers. Also, the CIA was doling out press passes to, they actually got their news editors that were also on their payroll at ABC and CBS and other things to dole out press passes to CIA agents to give them an excuse to go and report on events in Iran or in, name a hotspot that needs to be destabilized. And you'll always be sure that you have reporters on the scene on site, which, that's not a practice of the 70s that disappeared. This is where, at the very end, people remember Tucker Carlson gave a little poke to Putin saying, how about that news reporter finally be released from a Moscow prison? And Putin's like, clearly, Tucker, you must know that this is not a news reporter.
He beclowned himself. He beclowned himself when he said it's not like this guy's a spy. And Putin was like, yeah, he is.
No, what I loved at the very beginning of that discussion is where Putin took a little jab at Tucker, saying, "Well, you see, the CIA has done this and this and this, and they use news reporters, but I know that." Luckily, they didn't accept you when you applied for the CIA. Wink, wink. And
dude,
that was wonderful.
He totally called him out.
Wonderfully. Yeah, that was nice.
Totally called him out. Totally called him out. It was hilarious. I want to read this one, it's like 2 sentences, this paragraph, because I think you're gonna laugh when you hear this. This is the second to last paragraph in the story. It says, both services, and it's talking about the GIA, General Intelligence Agency, which is like the intelligence agency of Egypt. It's saying both services employ what Egyptians call the public eye. Hundreds of thousands of informers everywhere, in hotels and bazaars, in offices, on street corners, in all gatherings, etc. "Quote unquote, the public eye performs for bits of bakshish," I think I'm saying that right, bakshish, which is bribe money, small favors or whatnot, and the Soviet infiltration is short-circuiting everything. So they're saying, when they say the both services, they're talking about the Kremlin and they're talking about the GIA. So they're saying that the KGB and the GIA are working together. They both have these networks of informants, hundreds of thousands of informers is what they're saying, everywhere. I assume they just mean in Egypt. I mean, I don't know if they're saying in Egypt or the Middle East or the world, but I mean, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. Like, they're sitting there saying, well, here's what they do. They have all these informers. We don't do that, of course. Like, the CIA doesn't do that, but the KGB does it, and Egyptian intelligence does it. But we would never do that. Like, we'd never have paid informers or any of that kind of stuff. So this is it. It just can't get any more blatant. Like, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Like, here's all the information. Yeah. I mean, you don't have to be like a highly trained geopolitical analyst to piece it all together and be like, all right, well, obviously the CIA has been lying to its own people and misrepresenting a lot of these situations. It doesn't mean, by the way, like the KGB were good. Like, that doesn't, like, both things can be true, but it's just like the CIA, like being exalted as like the white hats and the good guys, and the KGB are the bad guys. It's like, no, they were both probably involved in awful things. So
yes, so vital, and it's so good to take a step back out of the mire and the noise that we're living in, and just breathe a little bit, meditate about some of these lessons of history, because it's all being done again. This is not a new thing. We're being told what if people are Democrats, they're being told, hey, every single so-called like red American conspiracy theorist. When I say red American, they're thinking like KGB agent is a stooge of Putin, and Putin has these pillars of disinformation and operatives. He even put Trump in power. He's trying to get Trump back in there again. That's how they've been brainwashed and framed by what they're consuming as the media, Mockingbird media that has profiled their psyche. There's a psych profile for Democrats. They've been profiled. There's narratives that have been woven to charge them all as radical fanatics against Russia, as being at the heart of all of America's problems, right? Their agents are everywhere. If there's a conspiracy theory or a theorist in your family or your next door neighbor, or your coworker that you overhear in another cubicle reading about conspiracy theories, that's a sign that they might be a Russian agent. So report that to whatever authority. And then inversely, don't think that, we who are more of a conservative bent are immune from manipulation as well. Like, we've been profiled as well. A lot of the trauma that we were put through during the Cold War and the misinformation that we were put through it was never resolved. The spin doctors and social engineers know exactly what buttons to press and how to trigger conservative Canadians and Americans as well. And for us, I mean, the narratives have been spun to, again, ignore the hand of the British Empire, the Venetians, the Mark Malloch Brown, Soros, infiltration takeover, the Rhodes Scholars, the Fabians, ignore all of that and focus all of our hate and fear energy on the fact that the Democrats are all run by Xi Jinping, and Trudeau is run by Xi Jinping and the CPC, and everybody who's in Antifa, and everybody, they're actually agents of Beijing and the immigration crisis. By the way, that's also Beijing, and Beijing has blood-drinking vampires as super soldiers that they've been training in Beijing to send in through the Darien Gap. And this is on Fox News, by the way. And you have Gordon Chang being brought in as an authority about China because he's Chinese. Skin color, but I mean,
his name's Chang, right? Gordon Chang.
You have to trust them, right? Of course. And it's like, no, so you got both the Republicans, the left and the right, who have been profiled. They're being given imagery that is all invoking Cold War psych trauma and damage that we were put through to make us either hate Russia or hate China, depending on the color of what we vote for. And in all cases, what's left out of the mix is what actually did 9/11, what killed JFK, what killed his brother, what undid the space program, what canceled, what brought in the consumer society model under Kissinger and the trilaterals. What that's just ignored because it wasn't Russia and it wasn't China that did those things to us. That was something else, and that something else wants us to not look at it, because if we did, we'd be able to understand how to fight it. And again, when you listen to Putin, I suggest people take what we just did, you and I here, and revisit that Putin speech and listen to it, because he's teaching people not only of the West, but also of Asia, of Eastern Europe, how do you understand the modus operandi of this beast? And then how do you look at countries who have done a much better job than we have at battling their deep state and de-weeding their deep state garden? Because the proof is in the pudding. They're building real things, changing the rules of the game in accordance with natural law in countries of Eurasia. And we're not. We could be benefiting from this, working with this to also combat the oligarchy that wants to kill us too, this whole death cult. We could be fighting it by working with these countries that want to avoid World War III, that want to avoid the big kill depopulation. That's why China got out of the Paris Accords, the Paris Climate Accords. They said, no, we're not going to do it. They canceled they got out and they basically said, we can all do it. They're a sovereign nation. They said no to the mRNA jabs. They said everybody can do it. It's not like, Brett Weinstein, alluding to the fact that they just said no to the mRNA jabs so that they could be immune from future bioweapons that they're going to generate to kill Western capitalist democratic, society. That's not what's actually at the heart of it. We don't see any evidence of this. They just
never mind that Rosemont. Yeah, never mind that Rosemont Seneca and all the companies that are connected to the Wuhan lab are also connected to Hunter Biden and all the secret bioweapons labs in Ukraine. And also, by the way, Qatar. Like, Qatar is at the center of all this. So you got Qatar, you got Ukraine, you got Hunter Biden. They are more closely connected to the Wuhan lab than necessarily the Chinese government. Although, there could be factions of the Chinese government involved, but who knows? But
there are.
Yeah, yeah.
There
So
definitely are, and that's
everything is
too,
two
right?
things. Like Paul says, everything is two things. Everything. And Putin, by the way, like people want to compare him to the KGB or be like, oh, he's KGB, so he's doing X, Y, Z. I would compare him to Peter the Great. Peter the Great in 1700 is the guy who modernized or westernized, Europeanized Russia. He forced everyone to cut off their beards. He put in a beard tax if you didn't, because everyone in Russia had a big long beard. And he said, if you don't shave your beard, you got to pay a tax for that. And he wanted them all to stop wearing animal furs and start wearing like the clothes that the people in Europe were wearing. And it was all about like getting their cult, because his mindset was, if we can start identifying as them culturally, then that will improve trade, that will improve relations. We'll stop fighting wars with them. So he's like, we need to assimilate with them so that we can stop fighting them and start, achieving the prosperity that they have. So I would like, and that's kind of what Putin wanted to do when the Cold War ended and he came into power. He's like, all right, guys, like let's build this anti-missile system together. And they're like, nah, like you can do what you want, but like we're going to build our own. And Putin was like, okay, cool. And now theirs is better than ours, right? I mean, that's what he said. And he's like, and they have hypersonic missiles. Yeah. So it's like, okay, well, should have partnered up.
Yeah, exactly. So. And it kind of like overthrows the entire game board that presumes that we can win a first strike against Russia and their allies, including China and Iran. And by virtue of these technologies having been developed as effectively as they have by Russia, which has shared them with their allies, that completely destroys all of the game theory computer models that have been used to generate our full spectrum dominance military program of encircling China and Russia with a missile shield. Because the thing was not about defense. It was always about offense and a threat to say, look, we can destroy you. So submit to one world government, get rid of your sovereignty and just give up, and because we'll destroy you. And it's all based on the idea that they don't have the capability of attacking us if that in retaliation, which they now do. So why hold on to this? Why
you create peace? Like that's peace. It's like if everyone hegemony is when one person has all the guns and nobody else has guns. It's like you could imagine what would happen next. That's like warlord, like I'm the king and you're all peasants. If everyone has a gun, like in the Wild West, nobody is going to walk into town and start shooting because they know they're going to get shot because everyone's packing, right? And so like that's what maintained the peace in the Wild West is everyone had a gun, and so you weren't going to walk in and start running your mouth because you might get shot. So it's that there's a lot to be said about that. And by the way, the Muslim invasion of Europe, the Arabs aren't doing that. That's the Jesuits, and they're operating out of Algeria and Libya, which are like deep state, like whatever. And it's the Jesuits that are the ones who are connected to that. So everything that we've been presented is actually something completely different. And we're going to have to do an episode on the Jesuits now. Because people
we do. As you said that, I'm like, I want to know about that. So, okay. All right. Let's vector out.
People have been asking me about the Jesuits. They've been like, explain the Jesuits. And I'm like, all right, let's do an episode. We're just going to have to do an episode on the Jesuits. So, yeah.
You want to do that next week, an episode on the Jesuits?
Yeah. Let's do that. Let's do the Jesuits next week.
You want a little bit more time to prepare?
We'll talk about it offline. Like let's figure out. If it's big enough, then maybe we do want to put it off so we can get some more time to prepare. But everyone hit the thumbs up. What's that?
I definitely hit the thumbs up, and I was just going to say the fact that we destroyed their countries, like the reason why you have Libyans in Europe, like taking our jobs and all that stuff, and the reason why you have Syrians in Europe and Iraqis in Europe isn't because they want to be in Europe. It's because we destroyed their country and bombed them back to the Stone Age illegally, and now they have no place left to go, and they're radicalized because we've also been pouring money since the 70s into doing these things, and and now there's an immigration crisis. Why did we blow up their countries? There's a lack of self-reflection on a lot of these things.
The funniest logic is like, we're gonna bomb Hamas out of existence. Oh, really? Like, so you don't realize that every time you drop a bomb in Gaza, you're creating more Hamas soldiers because somebody just got somebody's house just got blown up, somebody's family just got killed, somebody whatever, and now they want to pick up a gun and start fighting you. That is the prisoner's dilemma, which we talked about at GART in Florida with General Quast, and it's like You have to break the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is you're always going to want vengeance against, even if it's like from 100 years ago, you're always going to want vengeance. So the only way to break the prisoner's dilemma and to stop the cycle of war is to be the bigger person and enact peace. Teach your children to be peaceful and stop fighting.
Amen, brother. Amen.
Yep.
All right. That's some common sense dropping right there. Great. Now, Gordon, that was really, really edifying. I learned a lot. Thank you. And I hope everybody I know everybody also is very appreciative of what you weave together in this history lesson. And I look forward to next week. So I guess that's pretty much it, right?
Yep, that's it. That's it. We
all right.
Went long today. This is the longest episode ever, but I think we covered some good stuff. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hit the thumbs up, and we will see you next week.
All right.